All right. Hope everyone's doing well. This is going to be another video where we do a video review where we will look at a video from an apologist, a fellow apologist, Dr. Frank Turek with crossexamined.org. We're going to look at one of his videos he put out recently. And the reason why we want to look at this video is because he's going to bring up some important, I believe the video is called, Can We Change God's Will? Can we change God's will? So what I want to do is that video he put together, I believe he's at a college somewhere and a young lady asked a question, is to respond biblically. And I have a differing view from Dr. Frank Turek, and this is not an attack against Dr. Frank Turek. This is what a brother in the Lord will do, challenge another brother in the Lord, and make sure that our responses are biblical responses. I enjoy the work that he does, first and foremost. If anyone comes on this channel and says, oh, you're attacking Dr. Frank Turek, no, I am responding and challenging him to evaluate the answer that he's given. And I want to make sure that you do that with me as well. We should all do that, is that we should never get to a point in our discussions where we are beyond reproach. We should always be willing to evaluate if the answers we're given are biblical answers. So without further ado, let's get into the video. And then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and comment as needed. I'll go ahead and comment as needed.
I just wanted to know, this is a question that I was discussing with some beautiful friends of mine, and it's befitting that you're taking questions. So I just want to know, is it possible for a human being to interfere with or change the will of God?
Is it possible for a human being to interfere or change the will of God? It depends on what you mean by the will of God. If you mean the permissive will of God, yes, that's what prayer does. But the perfect will of God, no, because God is perfect and His ways are the right ways. But we can create, let me put it a different way, we can affect what happens in this universe by our prayer life. And God doesn't change. We're changing because we're praying. And God always knew whether we would pray or not, so He already knows the outcome. But us praying for something can bring it about. So
I want to pose this question. He said, God's perfect. I believe that. According to James chapter 1, He's the Father of lights, and every good and perfect gift comes from Him, from above, from the Father of lights, and there's no variation or shifting shadow in Him, so I affirm that. But he says something about His permissive will and His perfect will. The question of free will gets raised. Well, let's continue. Because when I heard this, thought that his response was a little muddled. But let me continue, and then maybe I'll be able to crystallize my thoughts.
God gives us the dignity of causality by allowing us to pray. We have a relationship with the God of the universe.
He gives us the dignity of causality by allowing us to pray. So this is where my first challenge to Frank Turek, Dr. Frank Turek, is he's bringing up this point that he's making about God giving us the dignity of causality. The thing is, what is the primary cause of all things in the universe? Is it man? Does man come before God, or does God precede man? this is a point where I believe he's dabbling to philosophical concepts, and it's easy to get sidetracked by those. But I question this because the Bible actually speaks to a few things, and we'll get to that, where it talks about God knowing the end. No, not knowing. I want to say it right. Declaring the end from the beginning. Declaring the end from the beginning. And with that, I'm referring to Isaiah chapter 46, verse 10. And with that being said, he's saying, my purposes will be established. So God has a purpose that he establishes, but that established purpose is not a contingent purpose. It's not based on man doing something, then God responding. And he's going to give an illustration here shortly with his football example and something, a DVR. I heard this, he gave this example, I think, maybe a couple of years ago. But this deals, unfortunately, this doesn't deal with God's decree. It actually deals with God's foreknowledge. So one of the things as we go through this video that I believe Dr. Frank Turek is doing, he is conflating God's foreknowledge with God's decree. In fact, I don't even see anywhere in this video where he even acknowledges that God has a decree. All right. So let's continue. Let's listen to what else he says.
Okay, so to clarify, I mean that supposing that God knows what's going to happen,
Right.
In any way can humans affect what he already planned to happen?
Just because he knows what's going to happen doesn't mean we don't have free will. Let me give you an
Let me answer the young lady's question, because he's about to give an example. The young lady said, just because if God knows what's going to happen, can the creature change what God has ordained to happen? The answer to that question is an emphatic no. You cannot do that. In fact, there are many verses in Scripture that speak to that. In fact, let's do this. Let's actually look at Daniel chapter 4, beginning at verse 34. Now, this is the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar. He's speaking here. God actually took him through the gauntlet, and now he comes to his senses about who the true God is. And starting at verse 34, he says, but at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards the heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is a everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. Verse 35. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven. Now, someone may say, yes, God does what he wants in heaven, but there's more. And among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? So it seems to be, according to Scripture, that God actually has a sovereign decree, and even the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar, who's coming to his senses, realizes that that is true, and God can do whatever he wants in heaven and on earth, and with the inhabitants of the earth. Let's go ahead and see what Frank says with his answer.
illustration of this. Let's suppose you love football, college football, and you've got you're away one Saturday, but you have a DVR. So you DVR all the games, and on the way home from or your party that day, you're out, you're on your way home, you're going to watch one of the games, right? As if it's live. But your friend texts you the score, and you go, I didn't want to know what the score was. But you go home anyway, you elect to watch that game. You already know what's going to happen. You already know the score. But does that mean the players on the field don't have free will?
Now, one of the things that Dr. Frank did not do is define free will, because the Bible doesn't actually teach that man has free will. I know when I make that comment, that may cause some heartburn for several people, but you need to realize, yes, the word free will is in the Bible, but we're not talking about free will offerings. We're talking about what is man's anthropology as described biblically, not through a philosophical concept. What does the Bible say about the nature of man? it says that we do according to our desires, right? And so you make a voluntary decision. God also has sovereign decree. And so if Frank, he has yet to define what free will is here. If he's talking about libertarian free will, well, in that instance, you're talking about being able to do make a choice, but also being able to do otherwise without being coerced by any internal or external influences. That's not what the Bible actually teaches. That's a philosophical construct that we have applied to the Bible. But notice that that word free will is never defined. So it seems like what he's talking about is libertarian free will here, some type of libertarian free will. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but since he hasn't accurately defined it, I believe that's what he might be talking about here. And that's really problematic because then that makes God contingent on the action of creatures. And so how do you even have anything like fulfilled prophecy, like Psalms 22 or Isaiah 53? Those become kind of toss-ups where God just rolls the dice and hopes that the creatures do according to the plan he would like, and he just got really, really lucky. So let's move forward and hear his response.
They still have free will, even though you know what they're going to do.
But does God have a decree? Okay, it's not about whether or not the creatures have a will. Yeah, no one would deny that mankind has a will, but does mankind's will counter man's or surmounts or makes God a contingent being? That's really the question. That was really at the heart of the question young lady asked, but unfortunately, Dr. Turek took the beeline and went down the course of defining foreknowledge, which no one's ever arguing that God has exhaustive foreknowledge.
In a similar way, God is outside of time. He knows what we're going to do, but we still have free will doing it. When He creates this universe, He knew you and I would be here tonight talking about this. But He's not forcing us to be here.
Now, notice the response. He's not forcing us to be here. Well, here's the whole idea of what the Bible teaches. So the counter argument to probably my position is that, God's not forcing, that's God's coercing in your view, Brother Caldwell. He's forcing creatures to do things. No, I say that you do things in according to your desires, but at the very same time that you do things in accordance to your desires, it's in perfect harmony with God's sovereign decree. There's no conflict here at all. So he introduces a canard here by saying, well, God's not forcing you to do anything. The things that you want to do, guess what? You want to do those things. When you don't want to serve and honor the Lord, those are things you want to do that action. And when you do honor the Lord, that's an action you really want to do. And so that needs to come out in the discussion as far as there is perfect harmony between the actions of creatures and God's sovereign will. There's no problem there. There's only a problem when you actually create libertarian free will, where you can choose to do otherwise without any influence to internal or external factors. Because we understand that Jesus taught, he says, those who sin are slaves to sin. So he's even reinforcing the biblical concept that we do what's according to our desires. Okay, let's continue.
He could have created a universe where we didn't exist, or we freely chose to do something else. We're still free, but He still chooses. In fact,
but God created this universe. Now, when he said he could have created a universe where something else could have happened, it sounds a little bit like Molinism, middle knowledge, where God has access to all these permutations and possibilities of actions of creatures, and then he activates the universe that fulfills his desired purposes. When he says God could have created this type of universe, yeah, but he created this universe, and he didn't do it based on being a contingent God based on reacting to the creatures. He did it based on fulfilling his glorified purposes. He has created, according, that's what I believe Revelation chapter 4 said. He created all things for his glory. We're created for his glory, and he's not rolling the dice wondering if whatever he aim to purpose would come to fruition. He's also not having to use a good thing and saying, well, I'm going to make a good thing and turn it into a bad thing. I'm sorry. I'm not going to have to take a bad thing and turn it to a good thing. Everything that God does, he does according to the counsel of his will, according to Ephesians chapter 1. So it's very important that when we give an answer, this is not a beat up, this is not an attack against Dr. Frank Turek. What I'm trying to do is make sure that when we hear these questions, we make sure, first of all, we're listening to the question, because the young lady was really asking about God's decree, not about foreknowledge. This somehow became a foreknowledge response, that first of all, we're listening, and then we're making sure that we're responding with a biblical response.
My colleague wrote a book, Dr. Norman Geisler wrote a book called Chosen But Free. So yes, God chooses, but we're still free.
And Dr. James White also wrote a book called The Potter's Freedom. So I would also encourage individuals, read both books and see who's being more consistent with the handling of Scripture. And so there you have it. There you have it. A quick video review looking at Dr. Frank Turek. And, there's a couple other verses I just want to bring out quickly, and then I'll conclude for this video. I already mentioned Daniel chapter 4. I already mentioned Isaiah chapter 46. But there are a few other things we need to discuss, bring out. One thing I want you to consider this. In Isaiah chapter 10, you have God purposing the use of the Assyrians for what purpose? To punish sinful Israel. Think about this. And he does it to punish sinful Israel, but the Assyrians, the intention of their hearts are wicked. And so consequently, God later punishes Assyria for the intentions of their heart. See, God's purposes and what he does is for his self-glorification. But at the very same time, God will also punish those based on the intentions of their heart. And there's no problem here. See, you have a perfect example of God's harmony. Even in that same chapter, what you also see is the perfect harmony between God's judgment and wrath and God's mercy and grace. Why do I say mercy and grace? Because in that same chapter, which also reflects what you see in Romans chapter 11, verse 5, is God choosing, because of his gracious choice, a remnant. Even out of that justice and wrath that he does, he also reflects his mercy and his grace. And all in concert with the decisions, the voluntary decisions and choices of free will creatures. All right. Well, I mean free will creatures, but creatures in their creaturely freedom. That's what I meant. Okay. Hope this video was edifying. Until next time.